All right, so welcome to the deep dive, where we take your curiosity and really run with it. Basically, you give us something that's caught your interest, and we unpack it. We go deep, we find all the juicy bits, and by the end, well, you're going to be the most informed person at the water cooler, that's for sure.
Exactly. Today's deep dive is brought to us by The Learner, who submitted something pretty fascinating, I gotta say. We're talking a YouTube transcript, but not just any transcript, mind you.
Oh, no, no, this is something special, right?
Absolutely. This one's a transcript of a hypnotherapy session. It's actually originally in Polish. The title is 260PL Magda, UFO Wilio a Gypsy Ewelina Jackowska, Team Grifasi. But we had it translated, all ready to go for our deep dive today.
So we're dealing with hypnosis, past lives, Egypt, and potentially even UFOs. I mean, where do we even begin with this?
Well, right off the bat, the hypnotherapist zeroes in on two pretty intense traumas that Magda, the subject of the session, seems to be carrying with her.
So we're jumping right into the thick of it.
Yeah, we're going straight to the source of her troubles, it seems. One of these traumas involves ancient Egypt, where she had this overwhelming experience of being completely restricted by bandages. And then there's another one, also a past life, where she's bound with chains and can't speak because of a gag.
Wow, that's heavy stuff right there. And I guess even at this early stage, it kind of points towards a recurring theme for Magda, right? This feeling of being trapped, being completely helpless.
Exactly. Now, another thing that's worth noting for you, the learner, is that the hypnotherapist specifically mentions how present Magda is in her body at the very beginning of the session.
So this isn't just some vague, hazy memory from the distant past.
Not at all. This suggests that these past life experiences are very much alive in her present reality, impacting her in very real and, it seems, quite distressing ways.
And what about the reason Magda sought out this hypnotherapy session in the first place?
Well, she actually states that it's because of this deep-seated fear she's been struggling with.
Okay, fear. That's pretty broad, right?
Right.
What's she actually afraid of?
This is where it gets really interesting. So she describes seeing these holograms, multiple versions of herself appearing behind her. And these figures, they can't move, they can't speak, and it just fills her with this dread. I mean, that's a pretty intense manifestation of anxiety, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. She even talks about this primal fear of being taken, being confined,
Yeah.
and how incredibly exhausting it is to constantly be battling this feeling. It's like it's become this constant shadow hanging over her life.
And you got to think about this too. This sensation she has of something lurking behind her, it could be significant. I mean, maybe it's somehow connected to those past life traumas where she was physically restrained from behind.
Oh, like she never saw it coming.
Possibly, yeah. Now let's talk about these holograms for a second, because the way she describes them is just so bizarre. They're infinite, each one smaller than the last, fading off into the distance, and all of them, every single one, looks exactly like Magda, crouched down as if hiding.
So that specific posture, this inherent need to hide, it makes you wonder if that comes from somewhere deep within her, some kind of imprint from her past. And there's mention of this blue color associated with these figures too, which is, I don't know, it feels symbolic somehow.
And here's a really key point for you, the learner. The source of these holograms, it's traced back to the very top of Magda's head, and it's directly connected to a super intense emotion, which is, of course, fear. But there's also this hint of irritation mixed in, which is interesting.
So are we saying that these visions, these holograms, they're not actually some external force messing with her?
That's what the session seems to be suggesting. It looks like it's all coming from within, a manifestation of her own internal state, like a physical representation of the fear and, well, maybe frustration she's carrying around.
Okay, so it's the emotion itself that's creating these holograms, not some spooky outside entity. And this kind of ties in with another one of Magda's deep-seated beliefs, this conviction that she's going to be stuck in this endless cycle of lifetimes with these beings, these entities.
Right, it's like she feels fated to repeat this pattern over and over again. And that connection between the infinite holograms and this belief in endless reincarnations, it's pretty powerful. It really points to this feeling of being trapped, which I think we can all relate to on some level.
I mean, the thought of being stuck in a cycle with no escape, it's terrifying. And where does this belief in endless lifetimes even come from? Is it something someone told her, or?
Well, the session indicates that it seems to originate from Magda's own deep conviction, not something imposed on her from the outside. But And this is important. There's the suggestion that maybe it started as a seed planted a long time ago, like a suggestion, and then her own fear just kept it alive and growing all these years. It's kind of a testament to the power of our own minds to shape our reality, even if it's based on fear.
All right, so let's dig into these traumas a bit more. We've got two main ones, right? The Egyptian one with the bandages and then the one with the chains and the gag.
Right. Let's start with the Egyptian one, which seems to be the earlier of the two.
So we're going way back in time here.
Way back. Magda's past self in this trauma is a priestess, high-ranking, in ancient Egypt. And this is where things get really, really intriguing, because during some kind of a ritual in this dark chamber with an altar, these flying saucers, they appear.
Whoa, hold on, flying saucers, like UFOs.
That's what they're described as, yeah. And as these things show up, there are all these words being spoken, words of fear, submission, sacrifice, that sort of thing.
I mean, this is supposed to be ancient Egypt, but the hypnotherapist understands these words, like they were spoken in Polish.
Exactly. So it makes you think, doesn't it? There's some kind of deep, energetic resonance at play here. Maybe language isn't such a barrier when it comes to these kinds of profound experiences, you know?
That's wild. And who are they directing these words to?
Well, the flying saucers are identified as belonging to these deities who are being addressed in this ritual.
So it's like a worship ceremony of some kind, with Magda as the head priestess.
It seems that way, yeah. And she's not the only one involved. All the men present, they're priests too, but they're definitely of a lower rank. So Magda's definitely in a position of power, spiritually speaking.
But what led to this whole act of submission? Like, why are they doing this?
Well, it turns out this wasn't just some random event. This was a regular thing, something that had been passed down through generations of priests. So it was like a well-established tradition or belief system centered around these beings and their appearances.
Okay, so the pattern was these flying craft would show up every now and then, and the priests, with Magda at the helm, they'd basically bow down, offer reverence, and submit completely, I guess in exchange for whatever these beings were offering or doing for them.
Yeah, that's the implication. And there's this overwhelming feeling of fear that permeates this whole location, which makes sense given the circumstances.
So these craft, they were physically there, like materialized in front of them.
The session definitely emphasizes the physicality of these things, yeah. It wasn't just some vision or spiritual experience, they were actually present in the physical world. Now, when the hypnotherapist asks about direct contact with the beings themselves, things get even more interesting.
Like, were they actually able to see these beings?
There's light, a lot of light, but it obscures any clear view. The beings are described as possibly grays, you know, the classic alien archetype, but the light makes it hard to tell for sure.
So even though they weren't fully visible, these beings were close enough to interact with.
Yeah, pretty close. But the main form of interaction, at least from Magda's perspective, seems to have been observation on the part of the beings and this ritualistic submission from the priests. Now, that light, that energy that was surrounding these beings, it wasn't just a visual thing, you know?
Oh, so it had an effect on them.
It had a huge effect. It communicated this feeling of power, control, which just amplified the fear they were already feeling. So this light or energy, whatever it was, it played a key role in the whole dynamic.
And this wasn't even Magda's first time leading this whole submission ritual, right? She'd done it before. So this was deeply ingrained in her role as a priestess, part of her understanding of the world.
Yeah, and if we consider Magda's energetic state, her subtle body, as it's referred to in the session, there's a consistent theme of fear and reverence. This state of being, it's been with her since childhood, almost like a form of, I don't know, religious devotion, but with this heavy layer of apprehension mixed in.
Okay, so let's circle back to this belief in endless lifetimes.
Yes.
We know it stemmed from Magda's fear, which, as you said, she'd carried with her from childhood. But what exactly triggered it?
Well, the session suggests it's directly linked to these childhood experiences with these beings. They'd show up and she'd be terrified, and this whole cycle of fear was reinforced.
Right, so the way she perceives it, that these beings, they come to collect information, data, that sort of thing. And her intense fear, it gets so tangled up with their presence, with this idea of them coming back again and again, that it morphs into this belief that she's caught in an endless loop of servitude.
Exactly. And although it likely originated from an external suggestion, you know, maybe the beings themselves hinted at their return, this belief is being sustained internally by Magda's own energy, her own fear. And here's a crucial point. The session makes it very clear that neither Magda nor anyone else in her group was ever actually taken aboard these craft.
So no abductions, no close encounters of the fourth kind.
None whatsoever. It seems like it was all about remote observation, information gathering, which is, well, still pretty unsettling if you think about it. Now, were there any other significant events in that Egyptian lifetime that left a mark on Magda?
That's a good question. The hypnotherapy doesn't really uncover anything else beyond these specific ceremonies, these acts of submission.
But what we do get a glimpse of is how Magda lived her life outside of these rituals. It's a picture of constant fear, hiding, keeping her head down, desperately trying not to draw attention to herself, always self-conscious about radiating this intense fear.
And you mentioned before this wasn't because of any direct interference from these beings. It was all her own internal fear.
Yeah, the session emphasizes that point. It's a stark reminder that sometimes our own inner demons can be the most tormenting of all.
All right, so let's move on to the other major past life trauma that came up. The one involving bandages, also set in Egypt. But this one happened a few lifetimes after the whole priestess ordeal.
Right, different lifetime, same location. This time, Magda's a male priest, around 60 years old, and he's about to be embalmed.
Embalmed, so he's dead, right?
That's what they think anyway, and this is where it gets really disturbing. It turns out that he's actually still alive when they start the whole embalming process.
Wait, so they bandaged him alive?
Basically, yeah. It wasn't a common practice in ancient Egypt, the session makes that clear. Embalming was specifically for those who had passed on, especially those of high status.
So why did they do this to Magda?
Well, it seems that while he wasn't actually embalmed in the traditional sense, he was wrapped in bandages as if he were dead.
Still, I mean, why? He was alive.
It seems it was meant to be a sign of respect, kind of like an offering to someone considered very significant. But the session definitely highlights how unusual and tragic this whole situation was.
So what led them to believe he was actually dead?
His heartbeat was super slow to the point where they just assumed he'd passed away. It was a physical miscalculation, nothing more, nothing less.
Oh, wow. So what happened next?
Well, once he was declared dead, everything happened really fast. They washed him, bandaged him tightly, put him in a sarcophagus, and sealed it with a stone lid. And, well, the outcome, as you can imagine, was absolutely horrific. Magda wakes up inside this airtight tomb, can't breathe, and suffocates.
Oh my God, that's awful. So a lot of trauma there, right? The feeling of being trapped, the suffocation, it must have been terrifying.
Absolutely. And the session confirms that fear was the absolute dominant emotion during those final moments.
And what about the afterlife experience after he died? I mean, he must have been so scared and confused.
You're right. It was a rough transition. Magda's subtle body, her energy, it stayed with her physical body for a while, couldn't detach. She just felt lost and absolutely terrified.
So how did she finally break free?
The session suggests it happened almost unconsciously, possibly triggered by a brief moment of respite from the intense fear. It really goes to show just how deeply this fear of confinement had become a part of her.
Okay, so that's two pretty horrific past life traumas. Let's talk about the third one that came up, the one with the chains and the gag. This one's supposedly set in the 10th century, and once again, it's a male past life.
Right, and this one really continues that theme of being restrained, powerless.
So why was he captured in this lifetime?
Initially, it's not very clear. All we see is that he's taken for so much, which doesn't really give us much to go on.
So they don't even know why they were arrested.
Not really, no. And exploring the scene from Magda's perspective, from her subtle body, it's clear that she didn't understand why she was being captured either. She keeps repeating, "It wasn't me," which suggests maybe a case of mistaken identity, or maybe she was made a scapegoat for something she didn't do.
And of course, the gag prevents her from speaking up, from defending herself.
Exactly. She's completely silenced. Now, the binding, it's heavy chains, super tight. She's completely immobile, and they're transporting her on this wooden cart. It's hard not to see the parallels with that earlier trauma of being bandaged alive.
It's like a recurring nightmare, isn't it?
Yeah, and the session confirms that the dominant emotions in this lifetime were fear, a total sense of helplessness, and just this burning injustice.
Not being able to explain yourself, being judged and condemned without a voice, it's incredibly cruel.
And the scene gets even worse because as they're transporting her, there are these huge crowds, people cheering, throwing garbage at her.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's brutal. And ultimately, she's executed, beheaded by guillotine. Just awful.
So another violent death.
Yeah.
How does she experience the afterlife this time?
Well, she leaves the body with a ton of negative emotions. distrust, anger, a deep sense of injustice, and, as you might expect, just a whole lot of fear.
And I guess that point of exit, through the back where the guillotine fell, that could explain why she feels this presence behind her in her current life.
Yeah, it's very possible. Now, here's a question for you, the learner. When exactly did these holograms start appearing for Magda?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, was it after every trauma or...
Actually, the session clarifies that they started appearing after this specific lifetime with the chains and the guillotine, not after every single trauma. And there's another crucial detail. They're triggered by fear, but they disappear when she's feeling content, peaceful.
So they're like a barometer for her internal state, these visions.
Exactly. And at the time of this hypnotherapy session, it's like she's at a crossroads. She's still very much gripped by this deep-seated fear, but there's this equal part of her that's finally ready to let go, to release it.
Which is a good sign, right?
Huge sign. Now, another thing that comes up is this intense aversion Magda has to injustice. It triggers her emotionally, and it seems like this stems from another past life experience, one where she was just a little girl.
Okay, what happened in this lifetime?
She witnessed a murder. Another girl was killed right in front of her, and Magda was helpless to stop it. She was just hiding, terrified.
I can't imagine how traumatizing that must have been, especially as a child.
It was, and the session reveals that she carried a lot of guilt with her for not being able to intervene or help in any way. So we've got fear, of course, but also this shock at the injustice, the powerlessness. It's a recipe for deep trauma.
And we've touched on this feeling Magda has that these entities are coming back,
Yeah.
but the session clarifies that this isn't based on anything recent.
Right, it's not like they've actually shown up again or anything. It's all tied back to those pronouncements they made in those Egyptian lifetimes, about returning in the future. It's like an energetic echo that's just stuck with her.
So it's her own residual fear that's keeping this alive, not any actual current threat.
Precisely. Now, let's shift gears a little bit and focus on the present moment. The session notes that Magda's awareness of these past life experiences was kind of all over the place. Some she had a vague sense of, while others, they came as a complete surprise during the hypnosis. And this is where the real work, the active addressing of her fear, begins.
Okay, so how do they actually go about doing that?
The hypnotherapist starts by visualizing the fear as this violet light that's just permeating Magda's entire body. And there are certain areas where it's especially concentrated, like around her solar plexus.
Which makes sense, right? The solar plexus, it's all about emotions, personal power.
Exactly. Now, they dig deeper into the source of this constant fear generation, and guess what? It's visualized as this cloud in her solar plexus, and it's constantly emitting these smaller clouds of fear. It's like the self-perpetuating cycle.
So her body has actually learned to constantly produce this fear.
It seems that way, yeah. And this cloud, it's her own creation, completely internal, not some external force feeding it to her.
It's a pretty powerful image of how fear can just spiral out of control.
It is. Now, this leads to an exploration of the thoughts, the programs, the deeply ingrained stuff in her mental body that's connected to this fear. And these thoughts, they're visualized as orange.
Okay, and what kind of thoughts are we talking about?
Well, one really big one surfaces. It's this thought, I am hopeless. And Magda, she doesn't just acknowledge it, she genuinely believes it. It's like a core truth for her.
That's so sad.
It is, and you can see how this kind of negative self-perception just fuels that whole fear cycle we've been talking about. Now, when the hypnotherapist tries to neutralize this thought, to dissolve it, something interesting happens. Magda becomes completely unresponsive.
Unresponsive, like she's shut down.
Yeah, like she hit a wall. And this unexpected reaction, it prompts a rewind, a deeper look into what's really going on. And they uncover something even more fundamental at play.
Oh, so there's something even deeper than I am hopeless.
It seems so, yeah. This blockage, it reveals that Magda's fear, it's actually fueling this belief that she only exists because she's afraid. Like, I'm afraid, therefore I am.
Wow, that's a pretty heavy realization.
It is. It's like her fear has become so entangled with her sense of self that removing it threatens her whole sense of being.
So are we saying she needs this fear to feel alive?
In a way, yeah. And here's another piece of the puzzle. The session reveals that her positive energies are all blocked. She doesn't allow herself to experience joy, happiness, because she feels this deep sense of being marked somehow.
Marked, like cursed.
Kinda, yeah. And this feeling, it's traced back to that Egyptian lifetime, the one with the priestess and the flying saucers.
Okay, so how does that experience tie into this feeling of being marked?
Well, those priests, especially the males in that group, they believed that they were chosen, specifically marked, for this role of being intermediaries between humanity and these beings.
There's an honor.
In their minds, yes. They saw it as a sacrifice, a way to protect others. And within their isolated community, this belief system was constantly reinforced.
So it makes sense that Magda would carry that with her, this feeling of being different, chosen for something, even if it's something scary.
Exactly. And these thoughts, these beliefs about being chosen and marked, they're visualized in the session as being gold in color, which is interesting, right?
Oh yeah, gold. It's usually associated with something positive, valuable.
Exactly. But here, it represents this burden, this weight that's preventing her from experiencing joy. Now, to really drive home the contrast, the hypnotherapist does this really cool visualization exercise. 2 screens, right? One shows Magda's current life trajectory, full of fear, self-sacrifice, all that heavy stuff. The other screen, it shows a life completely free from those burdens. And the difference is stark. It's darkness versus light, negativity versus pure joy, freedom, you name it.
Okay, I can see where this is going. Which one does she choose?
She's drawn to the second image, the one with all the light and happiness, but immediately she says she doesn't deserve it.
Ah, there it is, that feeling of unworthiness.
Exactly. And that's another one of those gold thoughts, deeply ingrained. Now, to help her break free from this, the hypnotherapist looks for a part of Magda that's not so bogged down by all this negativity, a more conscious part. And they find it in her back.
So this part of her, it's aware of what's going on, but it can't really fight back.
That's it, yeah. It's like it's waiting for Magda to clear the way, to make space for it to come forward. And the hypnotherapist, she starts communicating telepathically with this part, encouraging it to recognize its connection to Magda's whole being, its power to make decisions, to change things.
It's like she's trying to wake up that inner strength, right?
Exactly. And they also confirm that this whole martyr program, this tendency towards self-sacrifice, it's one of those gold thoughts deeply ingrained in her.
So this conscious part of Magda, what happens next?
She's directly instructed to command the release of all those negative thoughts, the fear, everything, starting with that cloud in her solar plexus. It's a big turning point because now Naga's actively taking charge, dismantling all this stuff that's been holding her back.
Okay, so she's fighting back now.
She is. And immediately we see some changes. Her energy visibly increases, and that gag that was present in all those past life memories, it disappears. Like she's finally finding her voice, you know?
That's powerful.
It is. But to really make sure everything's clear, they go through all those limiting beliefs one by one. I am chosen. I am marked. I must suffer. I must sacrifice myself. I cannot allow myself joy and happiness. All of it gone.
So those core beliefs, those really harmful ones, like I am afraid, therefore I exist, and I am hopeless, they're gone too.
Gone. Released. It's a massive shift in her self-perception. Now, to really make sure all this negativity is gone for good, Magda's guided to open a personal cleansing portal. It's like a way to release and transmute all that expelled energy, you know?
So it can't come back and haunt her.
Exactly. And remember that gag that was removed? Now she's encouraged to express all those suppressed emotions, anger, whatever she needs to let out. It's a cathartic release, a chance to finally speak her truth.
And how does she feel after all this?
Braver, that's the word she uses, which says a lot, right?
Definitely. So what's next?
Well, they revisit that first Egyptian lifetime, the one with the priestess, and Magda releases any remaining feelings of submission, any lingering belief in those entities, and any fear that's still associated with that whole experience.
So she's cutting ties, cleaning up the past.
Completely. But it's not all smooth sailing. When she goes back to that lifetime, this anger surfaces, like she's realizing the extent of the control that was exerted over her.
I mean, that's understandable, right?
Absolutely. But the hypnotherapist helps her release the anger to move into a space of calm, of regeneration.
Makes sense. So what about that second Egyptian lifetime, the one where she was buried alive?
They go there next. And the focus is on releasing the trauma of that experience. The fear of confinement, the terror of suffocation, everything. Any other lingering influences from that lifetime, they're cleared out too.
And that third lifetime, the one with the chains and the guillotine, they go back to that as well.
They do. And remember, that symbolic gag was already removed, so now Magda can release all the other stuff, the injustice, the fear, the helplessness, all of it.
It's like she's finally able to let go of the victim role.
Absolutely. And her perspective on that lifetime, it shifts completely. She sees those times as backward, unjust, and she starts to detach from all that drama, all that pain.
It's like she's finally gaining some distance from those traumatic events.
Yeah. And here's where it gets really interesting. For you, the learner, this newfound detachment, they connect it to Magda's real-life sensitivity to negative comments. Like, she's always been super affected by what other people say about her.
Oh, I think we can all relate to that on some level.
For sure. But the session emphasizes that this sensitivity is now gone. It's just another example of how powerful it can be to shift our internal perception.
So she's not letting those negative comments get to her anymore.
Exactly. Now they guide her to release any other remaining bits and pieces from that lifetime, even the memory of the beheading.
It's like a full system reboot, isn't it?
Totally. Now, remember that thought Magda had, the one about being stuck in endless lifetimes with these entities? Well, they go back to that, and it's visualized as this plate that's sitting on her forehead.
Okay, a plate. What's that all about?
This plate, it contains that belief, that whole program about endless lifetimes. And get this, it's not actually hers. It was implanted there by one of those entities way back in that Egyptian lifetime.
Wait, are you serious? So someone put this thing in her head.
That's what the session reveals. And it turns out all those priests got one of these plates. It was a way to control them, to make them more obedient through fear.
Wow, that's messed up.
It is, but it explains why that fear was so pervasive in that community. Now, the session clarifies that those entities, their visits, were primarily for research purposes. They wanted to learn how to manipulate and control those priests through their pre-existing fear.
So it wasn't about some grand scheme or anything like that. It was all about gathering data.
Yeah, pretty much. And the fear, it just became this self-perpetuating thing among those priests. They were feeding it to each other without even realizing it. Now, here's the crucial part. Magda's connection to this belief, to this plate, it was only sustained because of her own fear. Without that fear, it had no power over her.
So she was essentially holding herself captive.
Exactly. And now the hypnotherapist guides her to finally remove this implant, to clear any residual fear from the top of her head.
And what happens when she does this?
Those holograms, those figures that had been haunting her, they vanish. Completely gone.
That's a huge relief, I bet.
It is. And to top it off, they go ahead and clear any remaining fears of darkness and stuff that was likely amplified by those past life traumas.
So she's really clearing the slate, addressing everything.
Everything. And they even do a full scan of her subtle body just to make sure there aren't any other implants or any lingering foreign energies. And guess what? They don't find anything.
So she's free and clear.
Pretty much. But there's one thing that's still not quite right. Her throat chakra, the energy center associated with communication and self-expression, it's still not fully regenerated.
Interesting. So is this just a side effect of all those traumatic experiences, or is there something else going on?
Well, they dig a little deeper and discover that the root cause is this deep lack of self-belief. She just doesn't trust herself to speak her truth, to express herself fully. And they trace this back to another past life, one where she was silenced and forbidden from speaking out.
Okay, so what happened in this lifetime?
She was a high-ranking officer serving a king, and she disagreed with some of his decisions. She saw the flaws, but she was basically shut down, told to keep her mouth shut. And this experience, it created this energetic block in her throat chakra that's followed her through to her current life.
Wow, so that's why she has trouble asserting herself.
Seems so, yeah. But they address this prohibition directly, guiding her to release it and encouraging her to express herself freely without fear.
And what happens? Does her throat chakra heal?
Instantly. And Magda even lets out this powerful vocalization, like she's finally breaking free from that old restriction.
That's amazing.
It is. But just to be sure, they guide Magda to scan her own subtle body for any other lingering prohibitions, commands, anything that might be holding her back, and to release it all.
Smart move.
And as she's doing this, guess what? Memories of several other lifetimes where she was in a subservient position come up, including a particularly vivid one where she was a woman in a sultan's harem.
So this theme of disempowerment, it goes way back for her.
It does, yeah. But she releases these experiences and consciously adopts a belief in inherent equality, to counteract all that conditioning.
It's like she's finally rewriting her own story.
Exactly. Now, at this point, Magda expresses a desire to work on her sexual energy. She feels her feminine energy is strong, but her masculine energy is lacking, so there's this imbalance.